But where are you really from?
A podcast about the Asian American struggle.
Hey everyone, I'm Angela Lynn.
And I'm Jesse Lynn, and welcome back to But Where Are You Really From?
Today we have a special guest, first guest of season 4. We have Frank from 5AM Ramen. What's up, Frank?
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Okay, so Frank and I actually know each other from random happenstance of life, which is that when Ramona and I were living in Japan, wow, it's over 2 years ago now. That's life just like flies by at this point. But when we were in Japan for a few months, we went on several ramen tours that I think we booked through Airbnb, but they were hosted by Frank and his company, 5AM Ramen, and they were super cool because ramen's one of my favorite things, so this was like at the top of my list of things I wanted to do, and it was like, what better way to like find the best ramen than to just have someone shuttle me from like the best spot to spot around Tokyo. So we did it twice, I think, because we liked it so much. But yeah, that's how I met Frank, and it's cool that now our paths are crossing again. And yeah, how have you been? Haven't seen you in over 2 years.
I've been good. No, you both are definitely ramen tour veterans, I think, having done the tour more than once. But no, I've been great. Of course, it's been a interesting turn of events around the world, challenging and things like that. But no, it's great to reconnect here.
Okay, well, I know you, but Jesse doesn't know you, and our listeners don't know you. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit about like where you are and what 5AM Ramen is, and anything else you want to intro?
Absolutely. So Frank from 5AM Ramen / Tokyo Ramen Tours. I grew up in Tokyo. I'm actually Filipino and American, but spent my whole life in Japan. That being said, I've eaten a lot of ramen up to now, including from childhood. If you add it all up, I've had thousands of bowls up to now, and that does not include instant ramen. So I love ramen, and a few years ago, I was fortunately able to create a business centered on ramen. And as Angela had mentioned, I did ramen tours basically right before, full swing right before the pandemic. But I think now very much still I'm involved in ramen, and I definitely live and breathe ramen, let's say.
Okay, and you already mentioned a few interesting tidbits, but Filipino-American, lived in Japan your whole life. So how would you answer our very standard question on this show, but where are you really from?
I'd say maybe how much time do you have? Or I'm just as confused. So, I think it's difficult because for some of us, and I'm sure many listeners can relate. It's sometimes hard to put yourself in a box. I'm Filipino and American, biracial, bicultural, whatever you want to call it. But I also grew up in Japan, so having grown up, maybe feeling partially Japanese, but partially Filipino, partially American, maybe not, quite one or the other so dominantly, I guess, but maybe a little bit of everything is the right answer. So Filipino-American that grew up in Japan.
And how was that like growing up? Because I feel like Jesse and I have talked a little bit about, at least like my perception of Japan from, I was only there for a few months, but like trying to assimilate. I was working there with my company, so I was doing like normal business hours and trying to just like blend in. And so I have my own kind of like perception of the culture, but you grew up there, but you're not technically Japanese, but I know there are some like norms they place on people. What was that like growing up where you were like, I feel Japanese, or I'm not like, blood Japanese, or was that any tension with that, or it was just, you just were?
No, I think you got a sense of like what it's like to be here, and working here too is very different. Just like living here as opposed to just visiting the country and maybe only seeing it on a surface level. Japan's a great country, of course, but given that, 98% of the population, maybe even 99% is Japanese, and you go back to the 80s and 90s when I was growing up, I definitely stood out like a sore thumb. Although Japan is changing, it is becoming more diverse. it still is not that diverse relative to other countries. So it was interesting kind of growing up in that environment, as you suggested, not being living in Japan, but not being Japanese by blood. And, that's kind of how Japan also measures whether you're Japanese or not, right? Whether that's right or not, putting that aside. You're either Japanese or you're not. They categorize you, put you in that box. It's very black and white in that sense. But for me, I guess what was interesting was that I went to an international school, and there were a lot of other kids like me. Whereas if I went to a Japanese school, it might have been a very different experience. I might have been the only non-Japanese kid in middle school, high school, but at the international school, there were so many other confused, I joke, confused kids like me. So the experience was very relatable, and it wasn't that unusual. It wasn't like growing up, oh, who am I? Of course, I think all of us, in some way or another might have identity issues, when we're teenagers, for example, but it was never that pronounced. I was kind of, for lack of a better way of putting it, maybe in a bubble within Tokyo. And as you said, maybe now, even as an adult, I can kind of hover back and forth between that bubble. I would have challenges working at a very rigidly structured Japanese company. I would that would be difficult for me, even though I grew up here, and I would probably choose not to. But at the same time, I can kind of be outside of that, but also be an insider as well. Just because I grew up here, I know the ins and outs of Japanese culture, etc. So kind of finding myself in a unique position, I think, within Japan.
It's so interesting because I think a lot of the times we're talking about how to orient ourselves as Americans who are in search of our Asian heritage, and you're like of two ethnicities. You're a Japanese person in search of an American or potentially Filipino ethnicity. Have you gone to either of those places where your parents are from and tried to like explore, like, what's that feel like?
Right. Yeah, I guess in that sense, maybe like a reverse of what some people experience, or not a reverse, but in the same way. At one point too, as maybe a teenager, someone that's not as confident with who they are, there was a little bit of that soul searching, rediscovering. So yes, I would go to the U.S. I would go to the Philippines and be in Japan, and I'd be like, who am I? I wouldn't necessarily schedule trips centered on that, but every time I would visit those places, yes, it's kind of like, okay, well, I feel American. Like, can I try and be a little bit more American? You want to fit in, right? Same thing in Japan too. It's I'm not Japanese, but do I want to be Japanese? Do I want to fit in? Will I ever fit in completely? And maybe after a point, you realize, it's okay if I don't fit in 100% everywhere. I'm something else. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? Maybe you're not completely one thing. That doesn't define you, that category. You can be several things, and that's completely fine.
So maybe like one final question regarding like discovery of heritage, because a lot of the people we talk to are Western born Asian individuals. And so like our perspective towards finding our heritage is always this kind of like tension between the Western way of thinking and like having your roots. But your circumstance is like a little bit flipped, where you grew up in an Eastern culture and your part of your background is rooted in Western culture. So like when you were growing up, did you feel like that was a thing among the people that you went to international school with? They were interested in finding out more about wherever they potentially originally came from? Or it was kind of like, because you were in a Japanese environment and Japanese culture, it wasn't so much of a thing that was ingrained in you to explore, or that you were interested in exploring?
Right. That's a great question. I think, for a lot of us in the international school, maybe there wasn't as much of a burning desire to discover more about you. And I mentioned there were others like me. I think, I don't know if there was a burning desire to go to the US, and they were already exposed to American culture, whether this was pop culture on TV or at home. I think in a lot of these households, there were, as you suggested, there were, parts of Western culture already there. The school too, like I went to an international school with everyone. So the language of instruction was English. It was essentially an American curriculum. So it was never, in my case at least, like rediscovering my American side. Also because I would regularly go to the US, I was exposed to that Western culture from the beginning, as well as even Filipino culture by visiting the Philippines a lot. And then, of course, living in Japan, I was surrounded by it. So outside of school, that was where the Japanese influences would come into play. So I guess, again, it maybe comes back to having a little bit of everything, this bubble within Japan, being exposed to all of that. So for me, I never really had to go back and rediscover that Western side. I was literally exposed to both Western and Eastern side. And I think now, again, just being able to have that ability to choose, relative to the situation, understanding both sides, right? In this situation, I can be a little bit more Japanese. In this situation, I can be a little bit more Filipino and be, loud or karaoke. I'm going to stereotypes. Maybe that's not a good thing. But I think, every situation will call for certain things, right? And maybe being more like of a chameleon, but understanding, both sides, not identifying completely with one or the other. Again, I think it's that chameleon-like aspect that was definitely the case for me. And I think for a lot of kids that, grew up in these international school environments. You have international schools around the world. It's really a unique experience. I think at these international schools, you're exposed to so many different cultures, and it's hard to identify with one of them.
Not to open up a whole can of worms, but as you were talking,
open it up.
Okay, I'm curious because Jesse, I don't remember who you asked this to previously, but you said something like when you were abroad in Spain, you met someone and they told you like you guys care too much about race relations in the US, like it's too big of a thing.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, Frank, what it's been like observing the US become a dumpster fire the last year over, race relations and all the stuff that's been unpacked in the past year as this like outside view in, right? Like you have a stake in it because you're partially American, but you're living in Japan. And like, I would imagine the way the news at least is portraying it in Japan is from a Japanese point of view. So I'm curious what your like experience has been observing our crap going on here.
Well, the flames are pretty high, so definitely can see them from a distance. No, I think what makes the U.S. maybe unique in that sense, right? Regardless of whether like it's too much. That seems to have been your experience in Spain, right, Jesse? It was, why is race such a big deal in the U.S., right? I have observed that maybe like these issues are discussed more openly. People tend to want to discuss, their identity, where they fit into the whole thing. So there is a lot more discussion, I think, and certainly compared to Japan, and certainly compared to me, what I was used to growing up in an international community. It's just like this is kind of who I am, and that's that. So on the one hand, yes, there is a lot more of that discussion going on, but at the same time, that's maybe what makes the U.S. unique. Right now, you very much have an Asian American equivalent of civil rights movement, right? This is a good thing. And the U.S. is a melting pot, despite what's happening right now, despite the tension that's there. And Japan is really not. So these discussions, further progress, these are good discussions to have. But the U.S. is a unique place, right? What it means to be American is so different than here, where again it's very black and white, right? It's important to have these discussions.
It's interesting because I agree with you. It's important that we're having these discussions, and like we care a lot about identity in the US, and maybe because we are this melting pot, everyone has a little bit of identity crisis living here.
Right.
But like even listening to your responses during this conversation, I'm almost like jealous because it sounds like it doesn't matter as much. Like it's like you sound like you're pretty confident in like who you are, and like you're happy with this like chameleon type status that you have, and it doesn't bother you in the way that like I feel like a lot of us are very obsessed with like, but who am I exactly, and like where exactly do I fit in, and like we're just not settled anywhere. So I'm almost kind of jealous that it's not as big of a crisis issue for those living abroad.
I think for all, myself included, right? It's still, this is not to say I'm always with my, I'm always 100% confident, right? It's still challenging, but it's not so simple. I think it's all relative to your environment, right? In Japan, I can kind of go in the background a little bit, and I think in the US, with all these issues at the forefront, it kind of brings these issues front and center again, right? So it's kind of an ongoing thing. Now these questions are being asked because all of you are being asked, right? Like, what does it mean to be American, right? With everything that's going on. Whereas, in Japan, we don't really have that moment, right? There were moments like that. There was a few Japanese beauty pageant contestants that were questioned because they weren't 100% Japanese, like things like that. So if I was representing Japan in that capacity, not as a beauty pageant contestant, I could try. I entered once, but I didn't get accepted. No. But I think like if I was in that situation, maybe it would again bring those issues front and center. So it's all relative.
Do you love ramen, Jesse?
Oh my God, yes.
Don't you hate the shitty instant ramen we have here in the States, though?
Totally and completely.
What if I could tell you that you could get premium instant ramen direct from Japan delivered straight to your door?
Did you know that in Japan, instant ramen is actually legit? They put a lot of care into using high quality ingredients for the soup, the noodles, and the toppings.
But how do I get access to that when I live here?
Well, bitch, you're in luck. We've teamed up with 5AM Ramen, a business based out of Tokyo that is obsessed with all things ramen. They are offering premium curated sets of the best instant ramen in Japan to consumers worldwide.
And with our special discount code, you'll get 5% off your order and free shipping worldwide. Just use really from 5 at checkout.
Head over to instantramen.jp now and use our promo code REALLYFROM5.
Oishii!
Well, let's talk about food. Let's talk about ramen and give us, of all the things Japanese specialty, what is it that landed you on ramen?
What I really like about ramen is its diversity. There are certain things that define ramen. And I think, outside of Japan, probably I would assume, I think the most common ramen is pork bone ramen, right? Tonkotsu ramen, maybe some miso as well. But let's say beyond those styles, even within the world of pork bone ramen, miso ramen, there's so many subcategories of ramen. And what I find interesting about ramen is that given that it's actually only about 100 years old, is that it continues to evolve. There are new styles of ramen coming out all the time. Of course, there are certain things that, again, define ramen. If you go off too much in a bold direction, maybe you're kind of moving away from the definition of ramen. But despite that, ramen, unlike, say, soba or udon, it's not the same experience from ramen shop to ramen shop, from region to region. Ramen is really diverse. And maybe tying it into what we were discussing up to now, ramen really is a hybrid. It's like a Chinese-Japanese hybrid. And maybe myself being a hybrid, it's something I can identify with. Of course, it's tasty, and that's the most important central theme. But yeah, ramen really is a hybrid.
So for those of us who didn't go on a ramen tour and used to think that ramen was just instant cup noodles, what are the primary characteristics of like ramen from Japan?
Right. I think I mentioned this on the tours too, so we'll be taking a virtual maybe tour right now. But basically, broth, noodles, and toppings harmoniously coming together is the way I sort of look at ramen. And of course, that can define a lot of other noodle dishes, right? Mm-hmm. In Asia, for example. But there's certain things in the broth that I think make it ramen and maybe make it Japanese. You have a lot of ramen shops using dashi or Japanese soup stock, right? These are elements like soy sauce for the seasoning, but let's say kelp and bonito fish flakes. Kelp is basically giant seaweed, for listeners that might not be familiar with that, and also bonito fish flakes, basically dried bonito fish. These are very Japanese elements that they're used in the soup. These things alongside chicken and pork bones, that's where they took maybe a play out of the Chinese noodle dish playbook, right? Using things like that. So it's kind of like these more delicate flavors. Not that Japanese food is all delicate, but these more delicate things like kelp, again, and bonito fish flakes combined with maybe these more meaty things. That's the soup. For the noodles, ramen noodles are wheat flour noodles like a lot of other noodles out there. But what really defines ramen noodles is kansui, or an alkaline mineral water, lye water. Basically, this alkaline mineral water is what gives ramen noodles a more springy or firm texture. If this element is not in ramen noodles, sometimes people will not define them as ramen noodles. So basically think of ramen noodles as more firm udon noodles. Udon noodles are thick and slippery. Ramen noodles can be thin or thick, but it's really that alkaline mineral water that makes ramen noodles noodles. And then for toppings, you have your usual suspects, whether it's egg, spring onions, as well as bamboo shoots, sometimes the decorative fish cake in the middle, things like that. So I think with those three things, broth, noodles, and toppings, if you have 2.5 out of 3, you're kind of ramen. But again, this is everyone's definition is going to be a little bit different. You have things like pineapple ramen here in Japan. Is that still ramen, right? You're really pushing the boundaries. So it really depends on how I think you interpret ramen, but there are certain things, toppings maybe, especially in a soup, that define it. And sorry, I guess I should say noodles too, right? If you put rice noodles in ramen, maybe it's no longer ramen as much as I personally love rice noodles. So it gets a little complicated, but ramen shops will basically adhere to keeping a lot of those things that I mentioned, and that will define their dishes as ramen.
When you said pineapple ramen, I'm sorry, I just was at a restaurant the other day where I saw pineapple fried rice, and I just imagined like an empty pineapple used as the bowl for the ramen. That's not what it is, right?
Unfortunately not. That would be more fun maybe. But they have fully committed to using pineapples. They've got a pineapple logo, the interior of the ramen shop. There's pineapple decorations. There's even like a little lampshade that is a pineapple. Not an actual pineapple. That would be more epic. But fully committed to using pineapples in the ramen. It is delicious. Maybe it's not ramen, at least in the traditional sense, but it is very interesting. Again, ramen being very young, there's certain things you could do maybe with ramen that you can't do with other more traditional Japanese foods. I always mention this on the tours too, but sushi is so much more rigid, right? In Japan, there is a very rigid definition of sushi. This is sushi, this is not. Kind of like maybe, again, what is Japanese and what is not, right? It's extended to this. California rolls are not considered sushi. As much as I love California rolls, again, this is sushi, this is not. Ramen, it's open to debate, which is great. And what I find fascinating about ramen too.
Okay. Well, you mentioned instant ramen. I'm curious about that topic because something I noticed in Japan that was really cool is that the food scene is like largely a fresh based, like fresh cooked kind of thing where in the US, like if you're super busy for lunch, you don't expect that you're going to be able to sit down at a restaurant and like turn around an actual like fresh cooked meal in 20 minutes or whatever and be out the door. Versus in Japan, I did that every day in my office. So I'm curious because there's that culture. But then to your point, instant ramen is like a huge thing in Japan as well, where the shelves have like a gazillion varieties and like every 7-Eleven has like all the things ready for you to like make the ramen on the spot with the hot water thing and it's like a perfectly acceptable meal as well. So like what's the thought between like ramen versus instant ramen? Because in the US where like instant ramen is like crap, it's like it's the fake chicken like powder that you crushed up with the wavy noodles when you were 8 or whatever and popped as snacks. But is there that similar kind of mentality towards instant ramen in Japan, or it has its own place and is also good?
It definitely has its own place, and it's definitely its own special world. I think for me, I really rediscovered the world of instant ramen during this whole pandemic, just because spending a lot more time at home. And, no matter what you want, of course, like let's say on the one end of the spectrum, you have fresh ramen served, piping hot at a ramen restaurant, right? If you go, one notch down, or if it's a spectrum left, let's say, and you're having from 7-Eleven, you mentioned there, it's maybe a microwavable ramen, right? Still with fresh noodles, the shelf life is shorter. If we move one notch back from there, there's frozen ramen you can get at 7-Eleven. There's also the premium instant ramen, which you have non-flash fried noodles and seasoning and soups, everything separated and proper like toppings. This is like a high quality instant ramen. And as you mentioned, there's so many options for that here too, coming from different famous ramen shops, maybe different regional specialties, et cetera, et cetera. And then if we, go even further back, we've got the cup style instant ramen. That what I was just talking about was the bowl style, by the way. The ones that are shaped like a bowl tend to be better, more premium. And then the cup style is a little bit more basic, flash fried noodles. You just pop the lid open, you pour in the hot water. And then before that, maybe the most basic, which I think is what a lot of people associate with instant ramen, is the packet variety, right? So that's the most simple, flash fried noodles. How many cents is it per pack, right? That's the cheapest variety you can get, not the best for you. So in Japan, you have the whole spectrum, right? If you're, at home, maybe cooking for a family, the packet variety is great. Just adding vegetables and maybe some protein is good to upgrade it. But on the other side of the spectrum, going for lunch, as you said, at a ramen restaurant, you could be in and out in 20 minutes, right? Very convenient. So I think, as consumers in Japan, we're very spoiled, and relative to the situation, there, it will call for different things, right? So, I think yes, instant ramen included is a very important part of Japanese culture, and again, that whole spectrum there, relative to your price point, there are different price points relative to your situation, and what you require at that moment.
Wait, I'm confused about the bowl one. So that one is not just adding hot water, or how does that one
You
prep?
do add hot water. So basically it's like a styrofoam bowl in the same way that the cup is, right? But it's a little bit different because the preparation takes a little bit more to understand. You don't just, you do pop the lid, but they're normally 2 to 4 or even sometimes 5 packets. So the first packet that you put in, for example, is the toppings. Maybe the pork, like these are fresher, they are dried, but things like this you put on top of the noodles, then you pour in the hot water. After that, you're going to be heating one of the soup packets on top of the lid just to keep it warm. So you remove the lid, then you pour in a soup packet, and sometimes there are several soup packets. There might even be 3 sometimes, and you can put them in at different times. Then after that, you mix everything all together. So it's just a lot closer to what you'd be getting at a ramen restaurant. And another big difference, as briefly mentioned, is that the noodles are not flash fried. So you don't have as much of that artificial flavor, which is often the case with the packet variety. And I can tell you, it's pretty crazy how far this fancier premium, if you want to call it, style of instant ramen has come.
Hey everyone, we love doing this podcast, and if you enjoy our episodes, we would really appreciate if you could support us in any number of ways. First is by subscribing to us, rating us, and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. Second is by telling a friend. Third is following us on Instagram at whereareyoufrompod. Fourth is by buying our merch on our website. And fifth is supporting us on Buy Me a Coffee. You can find out more about all of these by visiting our Instagram's link in bio. And again, our handle is at whereareyoufrompod. Thank you.
How have things changed for you in the past year because of everything?
The pandemic certainly upended a lot of industries. Travel and hospitality, of course, was hit with a sledgehammer overnight. But I think, setting the stage, all of us in Japan were very excited for the Olympics that were supposed to happen last year, right? This was going to be Japan's banner year. All of us were, 100%, 150% ready to greet tourists from around the world, ramen tours included. Of course, that all changed overnight. It is what it is. And it's certainly been challenging, when you base a lot of your business around something specific and it's no longer possible. Of course, it's very tough, but I think, there's always a silver lining. And, for me, I've pivoted to some other things, including online ramen tours, selling the instant ramen that I mentioned. There are things that you have to look at. And if the Olympics had gone through, I would have been running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Excuse the morbid reference, but I think all of us in the travel industry, we would have been so busy that we wouldn't have time to sort of stop and think about, maybe other things that we could do. So the pandemic has allowed me to look at other things, maybe other revenue streams, and kind of reset everything. Of course, the pandemic has carried on a little bit longer, I think, than we all initially thought, right? So in the back of my head, it's like, okay, please, tourism, come back, because I do want to do all these things we were talking about. But at the same time, it has allowed me maybe to become a little bit more creative and think about, okay, how can I still have these ramen related businesses without people to physically be able to come to Japan right now.
Well, we look forward to being part of your big hurrah return to tourism whenever Japan allows us back in.
We will rent a ramen bus, limo even.
Okay.
We'll go
Sounds
big.
good to
Oh my
me.
gosh.
Well, shall we move into our closing section, Jesse?
Yes. So for our fortune cookie, Frank, we wanted to ask you, what's your favorite instant ramen?
Yes, this is a tough question. I think nostalgia-wise, because of the flavors that I grew up with, Sapporo Ichiban. If we do the packet variety, right? We're talking about just the dried flash fried noodles packet
No,
variety.
well, whatever. You have this whole world of instant ramen
Okay,
that
well,
you, yeah.
how much time do you have?
You get
You're gonna
one.
have
You
to
only
edit
get
down like
one noodle.
oh, no. Frank talked for an hour about it's different when we edited down to 5 minutes. I think Sapporo Ichiban. I know that's over there stateside too. I do hear the flavor is a little bit different in the packets stateside. I haven't had it in the States. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but Sapporo Ichiban, the packet variety in Japan, especially the shio or salt seasoned ramen, is a flavor like I will always love. I have fond memories of my mom making that at home. So for me, that's very much nostalgic. I think if we get into the fancier bowl varieties, the one from Michelin star ramen restaurant Nakiryu, their tantan men, basically a variation of dandan noodles, dandan mien, that is amazingly delicious. For the bowl variety too, I think one of my all-time favorites is also Sano ramen. Sano is a style of ramen that is relatively light with beautiful noodles and a relatively light soy sauce seasoned broth. So again, Sapporo Ichiban for the packet variety. And if we move into the fancier, more premium bowl styles, Nakiryu Tantan Men, Michelin star ramen, and also Sano regional ramen made by a company called Yamadai. And the Nakiryu one is made by Nissin. So those are three. And I'll maybe stop there so I don't go off on an instant ramen tangent.
And which of these, maybe all of them, can our listeners get from you?
Oh, well, the last two I mentioned, you can definitely get from me. I have a subscription model as well. So the Sano ramen is, it's relative to when you subscribe. But if people like it, I'm happy to introduce that as like you could just buy the Sano ramen. But the Nakiryu Tantan Men, the Michelin star one that I mentioned, you can buy those in packs of 5. And for everybody's reference, anyone that does purchase, you get video instructions on how to assemble them. So what you talked about there,
yeah, so don't dump it all in the
don't
thing.
dump it all in. You can, but the video instructions are there. So you have a very easy breakdown. And there's also, background information on the ramen. So it's kind of like you're collecting the different bowls at different times. So my idea was definitely to make it fun, interactive. And since people cannot come here, me bringing the ramen to you. And I would like to think that everyone will be pleasantly surprised with how good these instant ramen were. Again, I felt the same way when I rediscovered the world sometime last year.
I mean, I think the fact that you mentioned Michelin star ramen a few times as like something like the fact that a Michelin star restaurant would decide to make instant ramen, I think is already telling in and of itself of like the quality that this must be, because restaurants of that caliber would not want to like tarnish their brand by doing something that is shit, right? So it must be very good.
No, you hit the nail on the ramen head. Absolutely. That is, they take instant ramen to another level here. Let's say that beyond the simple packet variety.
Well, if all of you are salivating already, thinking about all this ramen, Frank has been generous enough to give our listeners a discount on his instant ramen subscription. And you have subscription and just one-time order type things too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So all the offerings, if you go to instantramen.jp, right? That's the URL.
Exactly.
And at checkout, use really from 5, you'll get 5% discount off your purchase, thanks to Frank's generous contribution.
And I believe free shipping.
Yes, free
Yes.
shipping, free airmail shipping too to the U.S. So you get it quite quickly. Things are of course a question mark now with COVID. There are less flights and things like that, but the ramen does arrive very quickly. The only issue to the U.S. right now is there's no tracking. I haven't had any issues so far, people losing their things, but right now because of COVID, there's unfortunately no tracking. But yes, free shipping and by air as well, not by boat. Otherwise, you get it in 3-4 months at this stage.
Oh my gosh.
So it's only some people have gotten it as quick as a week. Other people like 3 weeks. So.
Okay. Well, if you enjoy this episode, if you have questions for Frank about ramen or anything we talked about today, or you have a story of your own of living abroad, growing up abroad, or your obsession with ramen as well, you can write us in at telluswhereyou'refrom@gmail.com. The your is YOURE, and we'll pass along anything you want to Frank as well if you have a message for him. Okay, we'll have a fresh new episode next time, and until then, 再见, bitches.